Now, at this point, I want to just briefly touch on a few other items. One is that there are several views and practices that Leopold proposes the land ethic as an alternative to. And so these are things that the land ethic is in some sense incompatible with, and he wants to argue against. One of these is what he calls our Abrahamic conception of land. That's named after Abraham, who of course is um, one of the early leaders of the Hebrew people and also the Muslim tradition, according to a lot of Muslim theology. Abraham is this sort of early human, according to the Bible, who had a direct link with God, conversations with God, and God basically told Abraham that he could use the land for whatever he wanted. And so this Abrahamic conception of land that we've inherited now has bolstered humans in their confidence that they can do whatever they want with the land. But today, that manifests as us thinking of the land as a commodity, as something that can be traded, sold, manipulated however we want, something that we can own and do whatever we want with, just like any other commodity. And this Abrahamic conception of land is really incompatible with thinking of land as a community that we belong to. If we think of land as a community that we belong to, then it's not the case that we can just do anything we want with it. And so Leopold thinks the Abrahamic conception of land is a major obstacle to the land ethic. We need to get past this Abrahamic conception of land and develop an alternative conception, which is a community conception of land. And that's part of what the land ethic is supposed to do. Another obstacle to the land ethic is a conservation system based wholly on economic motives, or as he later calls it, a system of conservation based solely on economic self-interest. So what he has in mind here is conservationists, that is, people who are concerned about environmental conservation. They're in a sense they are environmentalists, and he's writing about organizations and individuals at his time in 1949. So government agencies and things like that. These are forces that say that they're concerned to conserve the land, and to some extent, I'm sure Leopold would agree that they do good work and necessary work, but they generally make arguments in terms of how the land is useful for human beings or useful for somebody's economic self-interest. That is, that it can produce crops that are valuable, or that it can holds natural resources which could be extracted and have a certain value. Okay, and the problem with that is that it doesn't recognize that the biotic community and members of the biotic community other than humans should be treated as having a value in themselves. I'm maybe going a little bit further than what Leopold says explicitly, but this seems pretty clearly to be what he has in mind. That if we always argue for conservation just on the basis of economic motives, then we fail to recognize that there's sometimes a good argument and a stronger argument to be made for conservation on the basis of the value of the biotic community as such, or the value of you could say ecosystem complexity perhaps as such. Now, this is one of those places where precisely what is the alternative, precisely what the land ethic proposes, apart from a community conception of the land, a community that we're a part of, remains to be fleshed out, I think, to some extent by later environmental ethicists. That Leopold may not have quite said enough to clarify what he has in mind as a conservation system, distinct from a conservation system based on economic motives. But he clearly is pointing to a system that only considers economic motives as inadequate. And then finally, part of the reason why Leopold thinks we need a land ethic is that a lot of conservationists in his time, he says, kind of expect to be able to just do whatever amount of conservation is there in their own self-interest anyway, and rely on the government to do the rest. Rely on making government agencies or laws or things like that to do the rest of the conservation. And this, frankly, this probably applies to a lot of people who would say they're concerned about the environment today, but they kind of wait for the government to pass laws and make restrictions before they change their own behavior. And so part of why a land ethic would be valuable, Leopold thinks, is it would motivate individual people. It would help individual people to start changing their behavior and their value systems, their evaluation of things, without relying on there being laws to force them to change their behavior. And he thinks that at some point, the kind of changes that we need, we're not going to be able to just get by passing more laws. It ends up being too cumbersome. It requires too much oversight. And what we need is a fundamental ethical shift in our way of thinking about things, in large groups of people's way of thinking about things, so that we can change our behavior, change our evaluation of things, and live in a more community spirit with the biotic community. So at this point, I just propose a very simple question, which is, do you basically agree with Leopold here? Are you convinced by his argument that we need a land ethic? Are you convinced by the details of the land ethic that he proposes? Are there any places where you disagree with him or think that maybe his ideas aren't clear enough, or maybe are otherwise questionable and might lead to problems?